Welcome to Historic Regalia, where we bring the forgotten voices of kings, queens, and empires back to life. In today's journey, we begin an extraordinary tale at the dramatic downfall of King Louis XVI, the last monarch of France before the revolution claimed his crown and his life. Stay with us through this 7-part chronicle, as we unravel the story of power, betrayal, and the inevitable march of history. The Palace of Versailles had once been the very heart of royal magnificence. Golden chandeliers sparkled above glittering halls, and the gardens stretched endlessly, designed to remind all who entered that the French king was second only to God. Yet, beneath the polished marble and gilded walls, the kingdom was crumbling. By the late 1780s, France faced a storm of debt, famine, and unrest. Crops had failed, bread was scarce, and the common people who once bowed to the majesty of their sovereign now whispered of hunger and betrayal. Versailles, once a beacon of power, stood as a monument to extravagance in a nation on the verge of collapse. Louis XVI was not a cruel tyrant, but he was a hesitant man, weighed down by the crown he wore. He loved hunting, locksmithing, and simple pleasures more than the ruthless art of governance. Where a decisive hand was needed, Louis hesitated. When bold reforms were demanded, he wavered. In his heart, he wished to serve his people, but he lacked the strength to challenge the storm that was rising against him. To the starving masses, the king appeared weak, a symbol not of protection but of incompetence. And in a kingdom that demanded leadership, weakness was the greatest crime of all. In May of 1789, the Estates General convened for the first time in over 170 years. Representatives of the clergy, nobility, and the common people gathered in Versailles to discuss France's future. Hopes were high that long-needed reform might heal the nation, but the old system was broken beyond repair. The Third Estate, representing the commoners who made up the vast majority of France, demanded equality and a true voice in governance. When they were denied, they rose in defiance. Declaring themselves the National Assembly, they proclaimed that sovereignty no longer belonged to the king alone, but to the people of France. In that moment, the centuries-old order of absolute monarchy began to collapse. On July 14, 1789, the tension erupted into violence. In the streets of Paris, revolution took its first breath. Thousands stormed the Bastille, a fortress prison that had long stood as a symbol of royal tyranny. Cannon fire roared, gun smoke filled the air, and the walls of the Bastille crumbled under the fury of the crowd. The prison held only a handful of captives, but its fall carried a far greater meaning. The people had risen against the crown and triumphed. Across Europe, monarchs trembled. For Louis XVI, the day marked the beginning of the end. The revolution had spoken, and its voice could not be silenced. By October, desperation reached its peak. Bread was scarce, hunger clawed at families, and anger turned into action. From the marketplaces of Paris, thousands of women set out on foot, armed with knives, muskets, and sheer determination. Their destination, Versailles. Rain poured, mud clung to their skirts, but still they marched, shouting for bread and justice. When they reached the palace gates, chaos erupted. The mob surged into the halls, searching for the queen, crying out, "A death to Marie Antoinette!" The royal family barely escaped the fury of the crowd. At dawn, the women forced them into a carriage and dragged them to Paris. The king, once absolute master of France, now lived under the eyes of his people not as a ruler, but as a prisoner. The triumph of the Women's March had broken the last illusion of royal power. Surrounded by thousands of armed Parisians, the royal family was forced into a carriage. The once revered king and queen were paraded through the streets of Paris not as rulers, but as captives. The people shouted, some mocking, others silent with contempt. The message was clear: the crown now rested in the hands of the people. Versailles, the symbol of absolute monarchy, was abandoned forever. For Louis and Marie Antoinette, the Gilded Age had ended, and a new chapter of humiliation had begun. In Paris, the king's new home was the Tuileries Palace, a beautiful residence, yet one that felt like a prison. Guards stood at every entrance, and the movements of the royal family were carefully watched. Louis XVI, once the sovereign of France, now had to request permission for even the smallest action. Ministers pressured him to accept revolutionary reforms, Yet his heart resisted. He signed decrees he did not believe in, fearing what might happen if he refused. The once powerful monarchy was crumbling from within its very walls. To the outside world, Louis appeared calm, but behind closed doors, anxiety and despair consumed the royal household. Marie Antoinette refused to surrender her pride to the revolutionaries. She was already the Austrian woman, the foreign queen who had drained France's wealth, yet in her mind, she remained the daughter of an empress, born to rule, not to bow. By candlelight, she wrote secret letters to foreign courts, begging her brother, the Emperor of Austria, and other monarchs to intervene. She dreamed that European armies would march into France and restore her husband's power, but every whisper, every letter, only deepened the people's hatred. Rumors spread that the queen plotted treason against her own nation. Her defiance, instead of saving the monarchy, only quickened its downfall. By the summer of 1791, the royal family could no longer endure captivity. In secret, they planned their escape. Late at night, under disguise, Louis dressed as a servant, the queen as a governess, and their children were smuggled out of the Tuileries. Their carriage rattled along country roads, heading toward the border where loyalist troops waited. At first, hope flickered perhaps freedom lay just ahead. But the carriage was heavy and slow. Villagers grew suspicious. Whispers spread that the king was fleeing. At every stop, more eyes turned toward the royal passengers. The king, clumsy and awkward in disguise, was recognized again and again. The escape that was meant to restore his authority only revealed his weakness. In the small town of Varennes, the journey ended. Surrounded by torch-bearing citizens and armed guards, the king and queen were pulled from their carriage. The people of France had seen enough. Their king was not a leader, but a fugitive. With jeers and shouts, the royal family was escorted back to Paris, their dignity stripped away. News of the failed escape spread like wildfire. To many, the king's flight proved he could not be trusted. The monarchy, already fragile, now stood on the edge of ruin. France no longer looked upon Louis XVI as a father of his people but as a traitor to the nation he had sworn to serve. The failed flight to Varennes changed everything. As the royal family returned to Paris under guard, silence filled the streets. There were no cheers, no signs of loyalty, only contempt. For the people, this was no longer their king, but a man who had betrayed their trust. The image of Louis XVI as the father of his nation crumbled. From this moment on, his crown was not a sacred right, but a fragile burden, waiting to be stripped away. Paris was no longer his capital, it was his cage. In the months that followed, Louis found himself a spectator to his own downfall. The National Assembly grew bolder, stripping the monarchy of power and placing authority in the hands of elected representatives. The king was forced to accept laws he despised, each signature carving away pieces of his throne. To the revolutionaries, Louis was not a partner, but a threat. And when secret documents were discovered proving his correspondence with foreign monarchs, the evidence of betrayal became undeniable. The king was no longer merely unpopular, he was a criminal in the eyes of his people. In the streets of Paris, the king's trial was fought not only in courts, but in the minds of the people. Revolutionary pamphlets and newspapers painted him as a traitor, a glutton, and a coward. Satirical drawings mocked his indecision, portraying him as a pig, a puppet, or a prisoner of his queen. Every rumor of betrayal, every whisper of foreign plots, was magnified until the king's name was synonymous with treason. Once, kings ruled by divine right. Now, his fate lay in the hands of men with ink and paper. In December of 1792, Louis XVI stood before the convention not as a monarch, but as an ordinary man, stripped of his titles. He was charged with treason, conspiracy, and crimes against the nation. The king defended himself with calm dignity, denying betrayal and insisting that he had always sought to serve his people. Yet his words fell on ears already decided. For the revolutionaries, this was not merely a trial of one man, it was the trial of monarchy itself, and the verdict would decide not just his fate, but the fate of every crown in Europe. After weeks of fiery debate, the decision came. One by one, the deputies cast their votes. Guilty. The verdict was clear. Louis Capet, once king of France, was condemned to death. The chamber echoed with cries of justice, but also with the heavy silence of history being made. The monarchy, which had stood for centuries as the cornerstone of France, was now dismantled in a single stroke. The revolution had struck its boldest blow, and the shadow of the guillotine loomed closer with each passing day. In a plain carriage, Louis XVI sat quietly, his hands folded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. There was no crown upon his head, no royal robes upon his shoulders, only the simple white garments of a condemned man. As he was driven through the streets, drums thundered to drown out the cries of the crowd, a wall of sound meant to prevent him from speaking to his people. And yet, in the silence between each beat, some swore they could hear him whisper prayers under his breath. For 20 years he had worn the crown of France, and now, in his final hour, he traveled not as a king, but as a man being carried to his death. At last, the carriage stopped at the Place de l'Arrêt tilde copyright Revolution. There stood the guillotine, a dark silhouette of wood and steel against the gray morning sky. Tens of thousands filled the square, their faces unreadable as some hardened, some trembling. Louis stepped down from the carriage with calm resolve. He turned to his confessor, Abbé tilde copyright Edgeworth, and whispered, "A son of St. Louis, ascend to heaven." With each step toward the scaffold, the weight of centuries seemed to press upon him. For generations, kings had ruled France by divine right. Now, one of them walked willingly to the blade that would sever monarchy from the nation forever. On the scaffold, Louis turned to the sea of faces before him. Summoning his strength, he raised his voice above the drums. I die innocent of the crimes laid against me. I forgive those who have caused my death. I pray that my blood may not fall upon France. For a moment, silence swept through the crowd. Some stood frozen, moved by the dignity of a man facing death. Others shouted to drown his words, fearful that compassion might weaken the revolution's resolve. The executioners seized him, bound his hands, and laid him upon the wooden plank. As the great blade was raised, the city seemed to hold its breath one final time. At 10:22 a.m., the blade fell. A single metallic crack echoed through the square, and with it, the monarchy of France was severed. The executioner raised the king's head for all to see, and the crowd erupted. Some cried out in triumph, believing justice had been done. Others wept, shaken by the sight of their sovereign reduced to a lifeless body. Blood stained the scaffold, and history had turned its page. Louis XVI, King of France, was no more. In his death, the revolution declared its power to the world, but also unleashed a tide of violence that would soon consume even those who cheered the loudest. After the execution of Louis XVI, the monarchy was shattered, but the revolution's thirst for vengeance was not satisfied. All eyes now turned to Marie Antoinette, the once glittering Queen of France. Once she had walked the halls of Versailles in silks and jewels, adored and envied across Europe. Now, she sat in a cold prison cell at the Conciergerie, reduced to plain garments, her hair cropped short, her body weakened by months of sorrow. For the revolutionaries, she was no longer a queen, but the very symbol of tyranny, corruption, and betrayal. To them, she was a Madame da tilde copyright Fisset, the Austrian woman who had drained France of its wealth. Yet to those who saw her in her final days, she was not a villain, she was a mother, a widow, and a broken soul waiting for judgment. In October of 1793, Marie Antoinette was dragged before the Revolutionary Tribunal. The charges were severe: treason, conspiracy with foreign powers, and even crimes against her own family. The accusations were wild, many of them false, yet they were designed not to prove guilt, but to secure her destruction. Throughout the proceedings, she faced insults and jeers, but she carried herself with a dignity that surprised even her enemies. When accused of corrupting her own son, she rose with sudden fire, declaring, "Nature itself refuses to answer such a charge." For a brief moment, the courtroom fell silent. Even in her darkest hour, the Queen's spirit remained unbroken. Condemned to death, Marie Antoinette spent her final night in solitude. By flickering candlelight, she wrote a farewell letter to her sister-in-law, Madame Mathilde Elizabeth. In it, she begged forgiveness, entrusted her children to God, and prayed for strength in her last moments. Her words revealed not the proud Queen of Versailles, but a woman stripped of all illusions, preparing to face eternity. She had lost her crown, her throne, her husband, and now her life. Yet in that fragile letter, she showed a grace that history would never forget. The guards who read it later said even they were moved to silence. On the morning of October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette was led from her cell. She wore a plain white dress, her once beautiful hair cut short and gray with sorrow. Unlike her husband, she was given no closed carriage, only a rough wooden cart that carried criminals to their deaths. The streets of Paris were filled with people, shouting curses and insults as she passed. Yet witnesses said she held her head high, her eyes fixed forward, as if refusing to give her enemies the satisfaction of seeing her break. The queen who had once lived in unimaginable luxury now traveled her last road in humiliation, but also in quiet defiance. At noon, Marie Antoinette mounted the scaffold. As she stepped onto the platform, she accidentally trod upon her executioner's foot and, with calm politeness, whispered, "Pardon me, sir, I did not mean to do it." Those were her last words. Moments later, the blade fell. The crowd erupted in cheers, but others felt a strange unease, for in her death, they saw not just the end of a queen, but the tragic fall of a woman who had been caught between privilege and revolution, love and hatred, fate and history. With the execution of Marie Antoinette, the final chapter of the French monarchy's ancient narration copyright game was closed. What remained was blood, silence, and the haunting memory of a queen who had once been the most powerful woman in Europe. With the death of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, France was free of its monarchy. But freedom did not bring peace, it brought terror. The revolution that had begun with dreams of liberty now turned upon itself with suspicion and blood. At every corner, whispers of conspiracy filled the air. Neighbors accused neighbors, friends betrayed friends, and even the faintest shadow of doubt could condemn a man or woman to death. Paris lived in constant fear, its heartbeat measured by the steady fall of the guillotine. In the Place de la copyright revolution, the guillotine became a machine of endless slaughter. Every day, carts of prisoners were brought forth, nobles, priests, peasants, and revolutionaries alike. There was no mercy, no distinction. Anyone accused of a counter-revolutionary thought met the blade. Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety ruled with iron hands, declaring terror itself a tool of justice. What had begun as a fight against tyranny had transformed into a tide of blood, consuming all in its path. The revolution had become a devourer of its own children. Yet the revolution's fury could not be contained, not even by those who unleashed it. Georges Danton, once the thunderous voice of the people, was sent to the guillotine. Camille Desmoulins, the passionate writer who had sparked the uprising, followed soon after. Even Robespierre, the incorruptible who believed terror was virtue, met the very blade he had commanded. One by one, the architects of the revolution were destroyed by their own creation. The revolution devoured its leaders just as it had devoured its king and queen. When the terror finally ended, France was left scarred and broken. Fields lay in ruin, famine stalked the land, and the cries of widows and orphans echoed across the nation. The monarchy was gone, but so too was the illusion of unity and hope that had once fueled the revolution. The promise of liberty, equality, and fraternity had been drowned in rivers of blood. And yet, out of this devastation, a new chapter was beginning to stir, one that would shape not just France, but all of Europe. Amidst the chaos, a new figure emerged, a young, ambitious general named Napoleon Bonaparte. He promised order where there was only chaos, glory where there was only shame. The revolution had destroyed the monarchy, but it had not given France stability. Now, the people longed for a leader who could restore strength and pride. Soon, Napoleon would seize that chance, and the French Republic would give way not to kingship reborn, but to empire. The shadow of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette lingered, but the future now belonged to the man who would crown himself Emperor of the French. The fall of King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette was not just the end of two lives, it was the end of an age. Versailles, once the symbol of France's golden splendor, now stood as a ghost of its former self. Where once there had been glittering balls and royal processions, now there was silence. The monarchy that had ruled for centuries was gone, swept away by the tide of revolution. And yet, the echoes of Louis and Marie lingered, haunting reminders of a world that could never return. The revolution was hailed as a triumph of the people, a liberty, equality, fraternity. Yet the cost was staggering. Thousands lay dead, cities burned, and families were torn apart. The guillotine became a cruel equalizer, sparing neither king nor commoner. For all its ideals, the revolution left behind both pride and pain, freedom and fear. It was a lesson that true change demands sacrifice, and that the road to justice is never without shadows. But France's turmoil did not end at its borders. The fall of the monarchy and the cries for liberty ignited sparks across Europe. Monarchs trembled as revolution spread like wildfire, shaking thrones from Vienna to Madrid. The world had seen that kings could fall, that crowns could be broken, and that the voice of the people could not be silenced forever. Louis XVI's death was more than a tragedy, it was the beginning of a new era. From the blood and chaos, a new France was born. Not the France of Versailles, nor the France of the guillotine, but a nation struggling to define freedom for all. The revolution laid the foundation for modern democracy, human rights, and the fight against tyranny. Though imperfect, though scarred, the revolution forever changed the destiny of France and with it, the destiny of the world. And so ends the story of Louis XVI, a king who lost his crown, his throne, and his life, but whose fall reshaped history. His last days remind us that power is fragile, and that history is written not only by rulers, but by the people who rise against them. If you have traveled with us through this journey, then you have walked through the shadows of Versailles, through the storm of revolution, and through the dawn of modern France. And so ends the story of Louis XVI, a king who lost his crown, his throne, and his life, but whose fall reshaped history. His last days remind us that power is fragile, and that history is written not only by rulers, but by the people who rise against them. If you have traveled with us through this journey, then you have walked through the shadows of Versailles, through the storm of revolution, and through the dawn of modern France. This is Historic Regalia, where the past lives, and history speaks. If you wish to uncover more forgotten tales of kings, queens, and empires, then stay with us, for the echoes of history are never truly silent. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Historic Regalia for more epic stories from the past. Until next time, may keep history alive.